Hi. So my work in the program in political thought and intellectual history is sort of firmly situated within contemporary political philosophy. And I focus broadly on historical, theoretical, and conceptual questions that arise from the study of political violence and nonviolence. And today I'm going to sort of talk briefly about one particular way in which I've taken up these questions through a paper that I've been writing during this term that critiques a particular account of the relationship between democracy and political violence. The object of my critique is what's called the minimalist conception of democracy. Now, this is a theory of democracy that's been sort of put forward in the past decade or so and has gained a sort of a special currency in contemporary political theory. It's a very sort of definitionally simple account of what it is that makes institutions democratic. Basically, its claim is that democracy is what you have when you can change your government without violence through the mechanism of elections. What makes this account of democracy distinctive is that it tries to sort of have this marriage of the descriptive and the evaluative. Because what it's doing is not just providing an account of what democracy is, but it also wants this to be a sort of picture of why it is that democracies merit being positively valued. So the minimalist conception in this way has both a descriptive or empirical or historical and also a normative or moral content. The way in which I'm sort of critiquing this concept of democracy is by suggesting that the concept of violence that it presupposes is itself implausibly or unjustifiably minimalist. The minimalist conception of democracy, when it says that democracy is what you have when governments change without violence, relies on a definition of violence as bloodshed, as the sort of thing that occurs when people take to the streets and fight in order to determine who is going to lead the society. I obviously agree that bloodshed is an important form of political violence, but I don't think that it sort of captures the full range of phenomena that it's important to talk about when we look at what it means for a governmental transition to be violent or nonviolent. And so the question that I raise in order to critique this account of democracy is the question of structural violence, about whether there are sort of social processes that through the sort of movement of political structures over time take the same effect on the embodied lives of individuals that sort of sudden activities of force or physical violence have sort of immediately. So particular examples of phenomena that might be identified as structurally violent include the higher sort of premature mortality rates in poor communities in Western democracies, the higher infant mortality that you see in certain minority communities, especially in the United States. And my claim is that these sorts of phenomena merit being evaluated as actually violent in a way that is sort of politically significant, just as sort of bloodshed might be. Now, my argument is that not just that these things are violent, but also that they shape electoral processes. So the bulk of my paper is this sort of laying out of an account of the way in which the electoral mechanism that the minimalist conception of democracy describes actually leaves room for political parties to be responsible for processes of structural violence that systematically limit access to the political sphere, to the electoral sphere, by unrepresented communities. So the point of this kind of argument is that if all we're paying attention to is the presence of elections in a society, that's not enough to tell us about whether this is a society that merits being endorsed, merits being positively valued. And so my critique of the minimalist conception of democracy is that its sort of overemphasis on this narrow account of violence doesn't give us the resources to justify the moral attractiveness of the institutions that it allows us to call democratic. Now, this is a very sort of abstract, theoretical, conceptual argument. But what I believe is that this kind of work in contemporary political philosophy can be important for eventually clarifying and shaping complicated issues of public policy or social activism, just as work in abstract physics research can sort of underpin medical science or computing technology. I believe that political philosophy has a role to play in the clarification of complex public issues. And so that sort of motivates this research project, which tries to look at the relationship between violence and democracy, and that's the sort of goal for my broader research interests as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that fascinating talk. Does anybody have any questions for him?
Could you give an example of something that would be called like nonviolent democratic transition under the minimalist definition, but would not be so under your definition?
So I think a good example of this is the way that and this is perhaps a controversial example, but I think that in the United States, the two-party system has created a pattern of governmental transition that, under the minimalist conception of democracy, is identified as sort of properly nonviolent and democratic. Elections are held regularly. The government changes between one or the other of the parties depending on who wins the elections, and no one ends up fighting in the streets over this. But if you look at the way in which wealth inequalities, access to healthcare, access to education, things like that function in American society, what you see happening is the systematic raising of barriers to entry into electoral politics for vast segments of the country. And I think that attention to the concept of structural violence allows us to identify that kind of process as a form of political violence that should be sort of judged as harshly as we would judge a government that sort of cracks down periodically on communities that it identifies as potential sources of dissent. Now, this is perhaps a controversial claim, but this is the sort of relevance that this kind of conceptual work could have to actually existing political institutions.
Vice Chancellor?
Robinson and Acemoglu just argued in a recent book about the need for these transitions to actually occur. But the problem that they don't tackle in their concept of this is that this is just about as much as those who are either defeated by a democratic process being prepared to cede power, and we see this in a large number of nascent democracies in Africa. How far are you looking at that ability of being able to cede authority with the concept that you can come back again, which is something that doesn't seem to occur in nascent democracies, where the pressure is actually always to move towards a more absolutist regime for whoever happens to be in power? How do you actually take that point on board about this ceding of authority to another when it comes to political power rather than merely the economic consequences of that?
Right. So the ceding of power to the winners of elections is sort of the central point of the minimalist conception of democracy. And sort of the focus of my research is less on what happens when people lose elections and more on the processes that prevent them from being able to lose elections to certain people in the first place. So one version of the argument that I'm making would be that the reason the Republicans always cede power to the Democrats and vice versa in the United States is because they know that because of the sort of structural barriers to access for parties with more radical political agendas, they'll never have to cede power to anyone else. And so each party knows that over time the government will be in control of one or the other, and it's only a matter of time until the electoral mechanism ensures their return to power. And so I'm interested in looking at why it is that structural processes make it so easy for parties in well-developed democracies, so-called, to be willing to give up power. And yeah, I don't know if that directly addresses your question, but those issues are definitely at the heart of this kind of work.
Thanks, Matt. I have a question for you regarding, you're talking about a national model. And to me, this is, if you look at it from an IGO perspective, where you have multinational structures, this would make sense to them because it's the lowest common denominator, really, for them to deal with. If you look at it from that point of view, do you think this sort of argument would be more useful for a large-scale IGO like the United Nations, or for smaller ones like the African Union or things like that? I mean, because trying to figure out if it's a west-east, north-south sort of perspective that's predominant in this point of view.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in the sort of theoretical work that I'm doing in the paper that this is sort of a summary of, I've sort of largely had to bracket questions of how we draw the boundaries around states, the boundaries around political institutions. I'm really interested in questions of global governance, of sort of political institutions after the state. I haven't really been able to bring those in fully into this work, but I think that insofar as I'm able to clarify broader questions about what it means for an institution to be democratic, what it means for an institution to be nonviolent, I'll be able to find ways down the line to sort of apply that within sort of other actual institutional models. But that's not that's sort of a step away from what I'm doing here.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. If anybody has any further questions for him,